Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming over, especially with Atlanta traffic and all that famous aspect of it. I am Janyra Pérez, from anyone who doesn't know me yet. We have two special panelists for you today. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity and what you need to know to protect your company. This is part of a series we've created here in Fulcro. We call it Fulcro Connect Exchange, where we're discussing special topics like this one, where we think it's important and is interesting. At least that's what we think. Maybe we're nerds, so that makes it special for us. So I'm going to start with introducing the panelists. We have Augie Yost from Amwins Brokerage. Amwins is an intermediary in the insurance world. It's a special insurance distributor, and they have specialty programs specifically for a bunch of things, including cyber. Augie has a bachelor's degree from UGA. That's why he was high-fiving other people here earlier. He has about 8 years of experience in underwriting, professional liability, cyber risk, technology. His started his career in Hiscox, doing small business insurance, and then he transitioned from that to other aspects of the insurance industry and world. Then we have Mr. Lliam Holmes. He is the CEO and founder of MIS Solutions, Inc. MIS is a provider of IT services. They do managed services, cloud environment, they do network design. They have a wide array of services on the technology world. Lliam in particular is a certified ethical hacker, and he has over 27 years of experience. You have a bunch of certifications, which is quite impressive. I'm gonna read them. He's a certified cloud security professional. He's a certified information system security professional, and he's a computer hacking forensic investigator. Needless to say, it's extremely interesting talking to him. So we are honored that you two have agreed and to spend this time with us and Fulcro and clients and friends of Fulcro. So thank you for that. Are you ready? Do you want to dive in? You want to dive in? While we were coming in, we've been talking, I've been saying a little bit about your industries, where you operate and all that stuff. So we have here, let me see if I cover everything, and if I leave something behind, you guys tell us. We have construction here. We have different type of construction. We have GCs, general contractors, developers. We have specific trades, concrete. We have restoration companies. We have driving schools. We have special validation engineers. We have the president of the Latin American Chamber of Commerce. So we have a chamber, a business association. I think, did I leave anyone? We're good, right? Oh, man. Yeah, we have an attorney here as well.
He's going to keep us all honest.
Yes, he's going to keep us all honest. So this is the room, and you have an insurance broker, and you have an insurance a wholesaler as well. So this is basically who's here right now. Does anyone have a particular question or a concern with this topic before we dive in? With the knowledge you have right now, if there's something specific that you feel you need to clarify and use this means for that? Well, there's a lot of information about cyber out there right now.
I'm more concerned about what we don't know. Right? You don't know what you don't know. So we might be under the false impression that we're doing things, correctly and safely, and we're wide open for anyone with bad intentions. So
great point. Yes. So what we'll do is we'll go over the panel And if you have any questions, then you can use one of the notebooks, write them down, and at the end of the panel, we'll have some time for a Q&A. Okay? So the first question to start off, very basic, is what is cybersecurity and why is it important? And who wants to go first?
I might need to lead off with the cybersecurity, man. I think he's going to have a little bit better definition than I do.
All right, so actually cybersecurity as a definition is a funny definition. Cyber back in the 1980s was simply a definition that they added to anything to represent futuristic. It doesn't actually mean anything, right? But security, as we all know, is to keep secure. I will tell you though, what cybersecurity means today is different than what it will mean tomorrow and different what it meant yesterday. Today, if I was to give you a definition, I would tell you cybersecurity, simply put, is how you don't go out of business. That's what it means to me.
There you go. Go a little less ominous. I think cybersecurity is having the right tools, people, and processes in place to protect any asset that's either connected to a network, your computer, or in insurance as well. Anything that hosts or holds private, sensitive information. So, like you said, you don't know what you don't know. Having the right tools, that's great. But are you utilizing the right way? Do you know how to use them and what you're even protecting? Do you know what's worth protecting? So all of that is something that needs to be contemplated when developing a cybersecurity program.
Yeah. In cybersecurity, we have to take a step back because we're talking about the risks, right? What risks are associated to that cyber world that we're talking about. And sometimes it's very common to think that the cyber risk is the physical hardware, like your computers, your network. But what creates the risk is really the data that you have in there. That's really what exposes the companies and create that possibly catastrophic scenario event. So there's a lot of misconception on that, and people think, oh, I don't have computers, or I just have this thing and I don't connect it to anything. Well, it's what you have in there and where that goes to in the cyber world. There's a lot of regulations around aspects of how you have to protect the data, and that is where the exposure is created with how you manage that data and how you protect that. It's very important. Yeah. Today we're hearing a lot about events, right? Intrusions and hackers. And do you have, both of you have examples of events that you've been involved recently? Of course you can't disclose with what entities, right? But what are the common types of events that you're seeing today?
So I can add to that. So I'll take a step back for a second, and I promise I'll answer your question. But a lot of what actually happens in cybersecurity is really around three buckets. There's people, process, and technology, right? Most everybody thinks about cybersecurity in terms of technology. What thing can I buy to protect me against the bad guy? And that's a piece of it, right? But there's also the people component. How do I train my people? How do I tell them what to look for when something happens? When we have something that does happen, who do they tell? Who do they notify, right? So there's a whole people component to it as well. And that people component leads into process. When somebody tells me I have something that's happened, I have to have a process around what do we do? Who do we notify? Am I compliant with certain laws where I have to tell government entities that we potentially have an issue? One thing I would say to you is in this process, one of the big mistakes that we see is that people will call it a breach. It's not a breach. You don't actually know what it is. You know you have something at this point. And while you're trying to understand what it is, it's an incident. Now that's really important because when you call it a breach, that's a legal term that obligates you to certain things as to whether you're going to tell your customers, if you have to call your insurance company, and it might just be somebody got an email that had something funny in it, right? And so you have to be very careful about what you call it. Now, if you back that up a step and we go back to the question that Janyra asked around, what kinds of things do we see? Hacking really is around repackaging something that looks familiar to you in a way that you didn't expect. And I'll give you 2 examples. One, we've all had people that call our offices and ask, hey, can you tell me who's your copier company? Or can you tell me, who do you guys currently use for internet? It sounds like a sales call, doesn't it? It isn't. If I know who your internet provider is, I now know where I would begin an attack on you because I know who you're using. And so you have to go back to that people and process side where we educate our staff as to what information is it okay to share. Because as a hacker, the first thing that I'm going to do if I'm going to attack you is I'm going to do what's called a fingerprint. I'm going to go on social media. I'm going to look at LinkedIn. I'm going to find out who your employees are. What contracts do you have? Who do you do business with? Who are your vendors? And I'm going to put all of this together and I'm going to repackage it in a way that you don't expect to convince you to give me something. And once you do that, I'm in. So I'll give you 2 examples, one grand and one small, both cleared for release, so no trouble there. I'm also part of a group called InfraGard. And what InfraGard does is it's a collaboration between the FBI and private industry around how do we protect American infrastructure, right? Roads, bridges, utility grids, these kinds of things. Well, we can turn that around as well. And here's my example. So a few years ago, we had an issue with Iran and their nuclear program. And we tried politically through all the channels that we could around how could we get them to abandon their nuclear program. And when all of our efforts failed to get them to do that, they then turned inward and said, what can we do to force them to abandon their nuclear program in a way that doesn't create an international incident? And so what we came up with was they looked at a concept called connected risk. And connected risk is actually really important to you, right? Because if I'm a GC and if I'm a prime and I'm looking through all of my vendors and I'm trying to figure out how to climb the ladder, maybe you guys have done a great job, but one of your subcontractors hasn't. And if I can get in lower down, I can climb up, right? So an example, what we did with Iran is we said, okay, where does Iran buy the parts for their nuclear program? Where do they buy their centrifuges? Where do they buy the uranium? Where do they buy their computers? Who maintains it? We figured out where they bought their centrifuges. And we wrote a virus specifically for their centrifuges that made their centrifuges spin 10% faster than what they were designed to do. Nothing that would cause any alarms, that anybody would have anything, that they would suspect that something was happening. But what it did is it drove up the maintenance costs of their nuclear program until they had to abandon them because they couldn't afford the maintenance. And that's how we repackaged what we knew to be able to drive a behavior that we wanted. And so when you think about that in your businesses and you think about the companies that you do business with, a lot of what happens is around this concept of connected risk. And connected risk is, if I can't get into you, or I do want to get into you in order to be able to get to one of your customers, right? This is similar to what we saw with SolarWinds in our elections, right? JBS Meats, Colonial Pipeline. All of these things were infiltrated through connected risk.
Do you have any examples? Before you go, you were talking about the subcontractors. One of the very famous cases is with Target and via the subcontractor, the HVAC subcontractor. They didn't really care much about what the HVAC had in their network. They actually cared about what that led them to, which was the Target network, and then all the credit card records, all the information that was there. So when you were mentioning about the measures that you take, whoever you contract with, also you should also evaluate that as well.
Yeah, we had one a couple of months ago with a company that owns a global armored car business, where they found that they had an old phone system that they weren't even using. And they got into the phone system, and by way of the phone system, they were able to attack their main corporate office and 2 data centers, and took them down, right? It was that connected risk where they found their way in through the phone system because they had terminated their contract with the phone vendor because they didn't need any moves, adds, and changes. It was an old phone system. It was working just fine. And so they sort of set it and forget it. Well, that becomes the least protected component, and that's where they find their way in, right?
Augie, do you have any examples or even catastrophic ones that you would like to share?
Absolutely. So I used to be an insurance underwriter working for an insurance carrier, and during that time, one of the products I wrote was cyber insurance. And if anyone gets a claim, a lot of times first people we call is your insurance carrier. Call our claims team, they'd call me. And so I've had plenty of cyber events that we've underwritten and paid losses on, and they've evolved over the years. Historically, prior to the past couple of years, most insurance carriers and insurance buyers are worried about record count. How much information do you have on your customers? That's generally seen as a direct cost of how much you would pay in a breach if a certain amount of people's information was lost or stolen. So in the event of like a Marriott, for example, 500 million people's, phone number, address, email, all that information they had was released. The insurance is going to pay to notify those people, credit monitoring, all the forensics that goes on the investigation, then any ensuing third-party lawsuits, any regulatory proceedings that may come of it in case you broke any laws. So that historically had been the big concern. Now, with the sophistication of ransomware and the ability for these criminals to cripple the system, ransomware attacks has been on the forefront of all the insurance carriers' minds because they've been paying out a lot of money lately to combat them. So I'd definitely say ransomware has been a large uptick. And kind of the silent, killer going around is just your everyday average cybercrime. So like he talked about earlier, Lliam, when he was talking about cyber is just kind of an add-on people throw on there. For some reason, anytime anything happens with the computer, they give it the name cyber. So cybercrime kind of sticks. And when you're buying cyber insurance or just a privacy risk policy, cybercrime will be there, but it comes in many shapes and forms and sizes. And everybody uses their own words and terminology. What we're seeing a lot of the time is obviously social engineering is huge. And that can be somebody calls you on the phone, pretends to be someone they're not, entices you to either give them information, give you maybe a password, or give you money, bank account number, or it could even be property. Somebody shows up at your office and says, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm here to pick up goods and service, or goods, load the truck up. Next thing you know, they're not the person they say they were. So those types of losses, even in that situation, and there's no computer involved, would be bundled up under a cybercrime policy or cybercrime in a cyber policy. So we're seeing a lot of that, a lot of invoice manipulation. Somebody gets unauthorized access into your network. They see your invoices come and go, so they kind of get it, they're going to sit tight, see your invoices come and go. They know, hey, we just bought something big from XYZ client. We're going to fraudulently email from your system an invoice with my bank account to that third party, telling them they owe me $50,000. And so you, as the receiving client, you see that email. It comes from an email you trust. The only thing different is the routing number, right? So you send that email, you send that check, and $50,000 is gone. So that's kind of the silent killer that nobody really talks about, because in this circumstance, if your client gets hacked, you didn't get hacked, you didn't have a breach. However, you were misled into giving money to somebody who you thought was someone you knew and trusted. So I think those are the bigger ones that we've been seeing and probably don't hear much about in the news, because they don't make a widespread impact like you would if you lost 100 million records, like an Equifax or a Target, Marriott, one of those breaches that really has ripples, but it's costly and it happens much more than you'd expect.
Can I add two things to that? Yeah. So I add two things to that. From an insurance perspective, I'm not an insurance person, I'll throw that out. From an insurance perspective, though, is a very, very big difference between you hacked in and stole something, or I convinced you to give me something. Only one of those typically are covered, right? And so that's a big deal. Here's a game. So we talked a little bit a minute ago about hacking is really about repackaging, right? I'll give you an example. Let's play again. I don't know how this will work out. Let's hope it works out well, right? So during the pandemic, of course, when restaurants started to open up, one of the things that they did to protect everybody is they removed the menus. And they have these little barcodes that are on the table. We've all been to those restaurants, right? And so what do you do when you go to those restaurants if you want to go to the menu? You take your phone out, you scan it, it pulls up the menu, right? How many of us have our phone connected to the wireless network at the office? Most of us, right? What if I simply changed the PDF file that was at the local restaurant, because they're not particularly cyber savvy, right? This is mom and pop, they serve lunch. I embed malware on the menu, you take it back to the office, I'm behind the fire, I got access to everything. One of the things that we measure in cyber is something we call dwell time. Dwell time is how long, on average, am I going to be in your network, behind the firewall, figuring out who you know, bank accounts, email addresses, what does normal flow of business look like, right? What am I going to exfiltrate, take off your network, put it on my network, and sell it back to you, or sell it back to your customers at a future date, right? On average, that dwell time is 9 months. I'm in your network 9 months before you know I was even there. I've collected every invoice, voicemail, email, all of your documents, everything that you saved on your local PCs. In fact, I've probably not only infected the servers, but I've probably put malware on every desktop and laptop. Because I know if I'm a construction company, I'm going to take that laptop to a job site. I'm going to take it to a customer. I'm going to take it to a data center. I'm going to be able to have you courier my virus onto another network where I rinse and repeat. That's that concept of connected risk again, right?
I think everyone here has received one of those emails inviting you to click on a link. You should look, there's a bunch of different things you should look at. The name they put, sometimes they just copy your name and they create email addresses that look very similar to yours. So maybe they change an M for an N, or a dot for an underscore, or things, a 0 for an O, things like that, where if you look at it, it looks very similar or the same as it should, but then they've changed it. And if you don't do it yet, every invoice you pay, you should confirm verbally with whoever is sending it, because that's, you were talking about what we're seeing the most is that people that are voluntarily sending a payment because they think it's legitimate and it's not. And Lliam said he's not an insurance guy, but he was on the dot when he was saying one is covered and one is not. There's a way of covering it, but it's not automatic, if you will. So there's a lot of voluntarily sending your money to another entity that once it's there, recovering that, it's very difficult. Yeah. There's a statistic also about that. The 90% of the breaches right now are because of that. The emails and the clicking.
94%.
94%.
It comes in via email. It starts in an email, right? What I like to tell people is, if you had a 94% chance of getting cancer, how motivated would you be to not getting cancer? I'd be pretty motivated, right? What would you do? Would you go to see one doctor and you're like, well, I went to the doctor, everything's fine, right? Probably not. You'd probably be extremely motivated to figure out, what can you do, right? Cybercrime is no different. If we know that 94% comes in the front door and it comes in an email, you really should think about, how do you protect your email and how do you educate your staff to at least get that down to something that you can live with, right? The average cyber incident at the moment is just south of $1 million. That's what you're going to pay for a small company, right? That's quite a chunk. And so if you have a 94% chance of spending $1 million, you should probably think about how you're going to protect that, right?
Yes. So not talking about big corporations, but just regular, small, medium-sized businesses. Do you think that they are well protected right now? And if not, can we start talking about some recommendations we might share with them? You want to go first this time, Augie, or keep doing the Lliam first, or do we want to switch it up, or do we keep? Okay.
I'll take it. I write a lot of cyber insurance for small, medium, large businesses, and historically, I would say, we are probably at a point now where we're more well protected than ever before. Probably because these attacks are mainstream, they're in the news, people hear about it, they're starting to acknowledge that this is one of the risks that faces our company. Every year the Fortune 500 CEOs get together and they say, what are the top 20 risks? And climbing the ladder is cybercrime, cybersecurity. But that being said, the criminals are advancing at a much higher clip. So being prepared now is great. They're getting in front of it, and there's too many doors to attack. So coming to the forefront, companies need to acknowledge that, hey, this is a risk. We do have this exposure, and that's step one. Now it's, well, what am I going to do? And employee training is a big one. Like you said, 94% of the attacks come through email. Do your employees know, like, hey, be careful when clicking on emails? Do you know about phishing attacks? Do you know that every person that emails you is not your friend. If you have to have these conversations, or even the best tools and security in the world is not going to help you out.
Onboarding and that education to your people, the onboarding process, because the newer employees they're always a target, and the people in finance and accounting are always a target. We have experience with that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I've seen far too many times, and one of them, it's a little silly, and only because it's not a big thing. I have a person at my brother's company, and he was on the job for a week. He got a phone call from somebody who said he was the CFO. I was like, hey, I need you to go out, and this is after hours, like go out to the store, buy $1,000 in Apple gift cards, and then read me the number on the back and send it to me. So he did, and didn't think anything of it. Monday comes around, he walks over to the accounting team and is like, hey, where do I submit these receipts? And they're like, what are you talking about? They're like, oh, I got a call from the CFO. And they're like, no, you did not. And the company did reimburse them, and they're lucky it was only $1,000, but it was a big eye-opening for them. And they're like, all right, well, this person just got here. Where did we go wrong? And it's not having that onboarding training, and that, and that happens to the person. They just walked in the door. This kid was right out of college. He didn't know it. He is, and I joke about it. And honestly, I think I would have quit that job. I mean, I think keeping him around is more punishment than firing him. Apparently he's doing well, and honestly, it probably was the best thing for his firm to have that kind of eye-opening shock, like this is something we need to prepare. He actually works in wealth management, and you could imagine what the potential loss was had it been clients' funds. Someone said, hey, I'm so-and-so, your biggest client, or I'm your CFO, why you're our biggest client? $1 million. And they send that to somebody, and now all of a sudden, it's a serious financial loss. You also worry about reputational risks. That's your largest client. Probably not going to be your largest client anymore. Probably going to be somebody else's largest client. So those are the kind of things that, they don't seem like an exposure that you think about, but you run the risk of jeopardizing your business and your reputation. And there are fixes that are, either relatively inexpensive, or in this case, almost free. It's just, hey guys, 30 minutes, let's sit down, let's talk about it. So things like that can go a long way.
Yeah. So I think if you look at compliance over the last, probably 10 years, this is really the goal of compliance, right? Whether we're talking about, GLBA, which is for financial advisors, or CMMC, which is around people who, create products and services for Department of Defense, or HIPAA, which is for healthcare. There's tons of them. FINRA, FOPA, they expand every day, right? But they all have the same goal. And their goal is, what can we tell you in this segment of the economy about how to protect your business? Now, the reality of it is, anybody who's involved in a business that has some sort of compliance standards, all of us look and we go, compliance, it's tough, it's expensive, it's hard, we don't want to do it, we don't want to get audited, right? But the reality of it is, none of these people are telling you to do anything you shouldn't be doing anyway. The only difference is now it's being mandated, right? And so, some examples would be around phishing simulation, right? And certainly onboarding, new staff. I can tell you there's some significant upticks in trends if you look around, the frequency and when people are phished, and when they have phone calls, and when the attacks tend to happen. It's within the first 2 weeks of a new employee coming on. It's Fridays after 4 p.m., 3-day weekends, 4th of July, Labor Day, Christmas, right? Because these are all what I call low tide events. It's when your shields are the weakest. It's when you're down. It's when your boss is probably on vacation. It's when the guy that you would normally call to see if they should pay to get the $1,000, that guy's on vacation. And so you don't want to be a bad employee, so what do? We're going to make an executive decision. We're going to make a judgment call. and we do the thing that we shouldn't do because the approval process has been compromised, right? It's all about packaging in a way that I can make you do the thing I want you to do, right? One thing that is coming, and it's very effective, it's not 100%, but it is very effective, is artificial intelligence is making some significant inroads into how we protect our businesses. And one of the real common things that we're seeing now is they have some applications that when you get an email, it will actually look at that email. It looks at the language pattern of the email. It figures out, have you talked to this person before? Do I know who else this person has emailed? How many people was this email copied to? Do I see any letter substitutions like the O and the 0 that we talked about in the email addresses? And it scores the email, and it actually adds a banner right in Microsoft Outlook that tells the user red, yellow, or green. Red, don't open this, this is bad. Yellow, be careful. We can't validate that they are who they say they are. Green, we're pretty happy you've talked to Bob a million times, right? And you can configure those technologies such that if I get a red one, I have to go through an approval process, or I won't even allow the user to open the email. Or if they click on the email, I'll pop up a screen and show them where that email would have taken them to, but I didn't allow the user to go there, right? And so we're seeing some new technologies enter the market space. And I sort of say it's almost like phishing email training, one email at a time is really what it is, right? But you'll see in your compliance standards in the regulations that you're required to do training on your staff at least every 12 months. This isn't something you shouldn't be doing anyway. The only difference is now they're mandating that you do it as opposed to being optional.
Yeah,
Right?
it's being mandated. Have you seen, well, I'm pretty sure you have, cybersecurity mistakes that we can share with them so that we don't go that route, either one of you?
Yeah, I think a lot of times is, going back to employee training, relying too much on just the tools and not your people. Oftentimes you can have all the tools in the world, but you click on an email, a link, you're out in the parking lot and you find a USB and you're like, oh, I wonder whose this is. You plug it in your computer, you're gonna have some problems. And then, not configuring your tools in the right way. A lot of people spend a lot of money on fancy systems and best of breed technologies, but they don't implement it widely enough or properly, or they don't know how to react when certain triggers go off. So they don't have the processes in place, a business continuity plan in place for cyber. If you're a manufacturer and your network goes down, have you had plans in place to divert manufacturing to another facility? Is that something you thought of? Are your manufacturing operations connected to a network with your IT system? Or is that completely segmented? So having the right plans in place as well as tools, I think is paramount to having a very robust cybersecurity plan. And then other mistakes, I think that kind of sums up that I've seen lately.
So not having the right plans. What else did you say?
Yeah, so not having the right plans and processes.
They're not doing the training, relying too much. What else can you add, Lliam?
I can give you a list off the top of my head. So the one thing, and don't point to your neighbor, but you know how every year you get these insurance questionnaires that you're supposed to fill out about your networking or cyber in order to be underwritten? There's a lot of mistakes that happen there, right? It's typically the CFO who does it, and it typically looks something like this. Yep, done, send. Here's what you didn't know. Those things, those questions on that survey are in the insurance business what they call warranty statements, right? Your underwriting is based on how you answered those questions. If something happens and you have an attack or a breach where you now need to file a claim, if you're an insurance company, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to pull up the questionnaire and you go, okay, you said you did these 37 things. We'd like to audit your network to make sure you did those 37 things because we want to understand what failed. And if you weren't doing these things and you just went, yep, send, your claim is denied. That's a big deal. And we see a lot of mistakes. People don't really look at those. And I'll tell you, if you look at those questionnaires, oftentimes the answer isn't yes or no, right? It's somewhere in the middle, and it needs to come with an explanation of what do you do and how do you do it. That's actually really important, more important than what most people realize. That's the one. The second piece is tools and technology, to make sure that you're doing your due diligence. From a legal perspective, if you guys were a bunch of attorneys, what we would say is, are you taking due care of the information that you're being entrusted with? When your customers give you information, are you taking care of that in a way that would be diligent, that you are doing something to protect that data? That's something they care about. A lot of companies don't take due care of their information. A lot of companies ignore mobile devices like cell phones. Without raising your hands, I would guess that the majority of the people in this room don't have antivirus on their cell phones, as an example. It's an easy target, right? And so there are the basics that you can do, but I'd like to end with this. Even if you were a rock star and you were doing everything you humanly possibly could, it's not if, but when. And that is the purpose of insurance, right? You cannot protect yourself against everything. You do need to do your due diligence, but this is a survival strategy, and that strategy is you better have insurance, and you really need to sit down with your agent and truly understand, do you have everything that you need? Because buying cyber insurance isn't a yes, no, I have it, I don't. There's social engineering policies, there's trademark infringement policies, there's all kinds of things that collaborate together to make sure that in your specific need that you are protected. And really that's the role of you guys, is to make sure that there's been some thought put into that, because at some point, statistically, it's going to happen.
Unfortunately. This is very basic, but in terms of mistakes, not having redundancy backups, because sometimes if you are a victim of an attack, one of the things that are evaluated is what was compromised and what do I need to do to regain that data, right? Well, sometimes with the help of the specialty forensic insurance company, all the different players, sometimes the result in that analysis is we're not going to pay the ransom to get that back because nothing major was exposed. We can do other things to mitigate, and then we pull your system back from a backup. Well, it's basic, but sometimes we don't have a backup, and that is important because you might not even have to pay a ransom if it's not a data that if it's not data that is critical or it protected. There's certain criteria, right? So that's, I know it's super basic, but I'm saying because we've seen instances where there's no backup of the data. You started talking again about insurance. So the cyber insurance world has gotten a little bit more complicated as technology gets more complicated. And we have Augie here. So can you tell us a little bit about the current conditions of the market right now?
Absolutely. So, I know Lliam mentioned the cybersecurity questionnaires and checking yes down the list and all the controls you need to get insurance. It actually used to be a lot easier. A lot of companies, you got firewall, you got your antivirus, here you go, here's your quote. Then they paid a lot of money. And once these insurance companies started paying money and losing money, now they start diving in and saying, okay, well, why are we losing money? So where are these failures being made? Even though it was on their side for not asking the right questions or not caring. But then they say, they look to their clients and they say, okay, well, where are the common indicators of where this breach occurred? And that's how they now form their questionnaires and control requirements around. So the market historically was what we would call a soft market, in that rates would probably go down year over year. That's due to low claim activity. The carriers didn't pay out nearly as much as they took in. They were fat and happy and eager to do anything they could to get more cyber insurance. And that led to broadening up forms, which means they would cover more things than they used to cover. They didn't have actuarial data behind that to support the pricing that they were charging would outlast the claims that they were going to pay, but they did it anyway because they wanted more and more and more. And as ransomware claims became more frequent, much more severe, they started losing money, and they lost a lot of money in 2020. In 2021, they started to recoup some of that. And they did that by tightening the underwriting requirements, so making sure that if they're going to issue cyber insurance, you can't just have firewall and antivirus. They're going to actually ask questions that are what they deem proven to make you a better risk. A lot of that is multi-factor authentication. So many companies dictate in different spots: remote access, anyone accessing your network remotely, not locally, for email, cloud resources, and privileged users. So anybody who can make any changes. So that was probably the first control requirement, and it was unique to cybersecurity because in other lines of insurance, you never used to get 10, 15 quotes one year and then declined across the board by every carrier you've ever seen next year. So this was very hard for the insurance companies to dictate. The insurance brokers, insurance agents had a much difficult job because they now had to go educate. And they had to tell people that not only was your insurance, in some cases doubling, tripling, going up by 4 times premium, you're probably losing coverage, and you now have to go out and purchase a new service, and that's multi-factor authentication. So that occurred in late 2020, early 2021, and combined with the losses, they had to increase rates. So 2021, 2022 has been about 2 years of rates going from X to 4X, depending on what you're doing. And now that the majority of customers that we see in the insurance business have multi-factor authentication, some of the other requirements, we're now starting to see that soften across the board, or at least peak. So it's definitely more expensive than it's ever been, but carriers are starting to recoup some of their gains. They're saying, okay, these controls that they've implemented have worked, and now they can start providing some competition. And with competition returning to the market, we're starting to see rates slowly go down. So I guess it's a big mouthful of where the market is right now. But it's difficult, and it's really unlike no hard market the insurance market's ever seen. Similar things have happened obviously in property throughout either wildfires, hurricanes, catastrophic risks come in. Insurance carriers lose a lot more money, so historically they cut their limits, they charge more money. This is different because now we have to also underwrite to all the controls, and that's something that just never happened. And it hit the agents, the brokers, and the insureds and the clients at the end of the day most unexpectedly. So it's been a pretty wild last 2 years trying to fight to make sure that everyone that we provide insurance for has this coverage and is educated and in advance knows, like, hey, you're going to see some changes at your renewal, and this is how we can get in front of it. So that's probably the most shortest update on the market conditions I can provide. But I think it's getting to be a better place, and the more education and the more people know about it, the better.
Perfect. So the final question is, what 3 things would you suggest us to make us our organizations more secure?
From an insurance perspective, I will say the main controls that would, not having these controls would probably prevent or definitely dampen your chances of getting a good competitive quote would be multi-factor authentication, remote access, email access, cloud resources, privileged users. That would be number 1. Number 2 would be having...
That was 1?
Well, yeah, it's MFA, but for many things. Good backup procedures. So having redundant backups, having them either utilizing a cloud resource or offline and segmented, meaning that at the end of the day, if I'm in your network, doesn't necessarily mean I can access the backups you did last week because they're offline, maybe removed by tape. That way they cannot be encrypted. Number 3 would probably be, other than employee training, control-wise, probably be, we're seeing more of a lean towards having EDR, endpoint detection and response. So a lot more insurance carriers are requiring that to offer any quotes. And then if you don't have these controls in place, you're probably looking at a minimal ransomware event exclusion or sublimit, which is very telling to what they're afraid of, right? It's the ransomware events. It's someone locking you out of your system and saying, pay me $10 million in Bitcoin, or you're never going to get your information back. And we're also selling everything on the dark web. So having these controls in place is very important right now, especially for getting cyber insurance.
Perfect. Lliam.
So I agree with everything you said, Augie. The EDR, the 2-factor authentication, all those are important. Backups, I think, are also, an unsung hero of this whole thing, right? And with your backups, there's something called an immutable backup, which is really important, but nobody talks about. Again, repackage, put yourself in my shoes. My job is to convince you to pay me lots of money, right? It's in my job description. That's what I do, right? And so how can you prevent me from doing that? Well, if I know my dwell time is 9 months, right? I have a long time to inspect your backups, right? I'm patient, right? So what I can do, though, is have what's called an immutable backup. And the way that an immutable backup works is, think of it like a CD. Once the backup is written, nobody, not even you, can change the backup. So that as the backup is successful, I know I have a point in time that I 100% can go back to. So that's probably the one thing. The second thing is, nobody really thinks about what I'm going to call an RPO and an RTO. An RPO is a recovery point objective. How much data am I willing to lose? If I back up once a night, that means at maximum I'm willing to lose 24 hours worth of data. Depending on my business and depending on what I do, that might be okay, it may not be okay. It might be okay for these 5 systems, it might not be okay for our order entry system, right? So that's RPO. The opposite of that is what's called an RTO, return to operation. If I had something happen to me, how long would it take to put it back? And a really good example of where this was misunderstood was the Colonial Pipeline situation. They had backups and the backups were good, but it would take 6 months to put it back because nobody ever tested to see, hey, if we have a catastrophic event, how long would it take to put everything back? 6 months. Oh, well, 6 months isn't good enough. can't be down for 6 months, right? And so one of the best things you can do to protect yourself is really look at your systems. Not everything is the most important, but you have systems that are really important and you have systems that are less important. Make sure you design your recovery point objectives and your return to operation objectives around what's important to your business. And make sure that your backups are good. My third one was everything you said.
That's a good one.
Can I do that?
That's good. Well, thank you very much. We want to open it now for questions. If anyone has any question, there's a microphone over there.
You're talking about training and training people and about training and how that it looks like. I think we have technology, we have improved software, but people always will fail somehow. So how do you improve?
Yeah.
You want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So yes, people will always fail. That is true. We talk about often when we talk about employee training, phishing testing. I think that's the main thing. Or spear phishing. That's sending you an email, pretending to be somebody else, making you want to click on a link. And one of the big training tools, or I would say supplements training, is phishing training, where you can get an outside vendor like a KnowBe4, and they will purposely, ethically, I guess you could say, email your employees trying to trick them into clicking on a link. And companies do this. My company does it. I luckily, being the cyber guy, I'm always very diligent, and I pride myself when I report it to phishing, because now I get a green check, says I passed, and I get all excited about it. But even successful companies, their phishing failure rate is 5-10% depending on your industry. So it's just as much awareness as possible. Now, what does employee training look like on a broad scale? It depends on your industry. It depends. Could be even more niche to department in your industry. So if you're an accounting team and accounts payable, your training might look something different than maybe if you are a BPO, or you're handling credit card data on day-to-day basis, and or you work at a company where people call in, they give you their credit card information, you enter it in. You might have a different, more niche training. So there's many companies out there that do this, and they can provide a blanket level training that's one size fits all for everybody. Or you can dive deeper into training specific to your industry and your department within your industry. And some insurance carriers will provide this along with supplemental services when you purchase a policy from them. They might say it might be training themselves. They might sub it out to a vendor, or they might give you access to resources that have kind of a one size fit all. So those resources are out there and available. And you can find it as specific or as broad as you like.
Yeah. I'd like to add to that. So it's about engagement. How do you engage your employees in a fun way, right? Because that's where the learning happens, right? So the two things you can do is you can use like a KnowBe4, which is what they do is they develop, phishing campaigns to try to get users to click on, and they'll give you a scorecard, right? And so you can kind of gamify that, maybe these, bonuses or little silly prizes that you have around that. The second piece, if you look at cybersecurity from a different lens for a second, there's three buckets that we really care about. There's the physical, the technical, and the administrative. The physical is all of our physical things, right? Do we have a lock on the server room door? Do we make sure that we physically have an inventory of all of our assets? All the physical stuff, right? The technical is all the stuff that you tend to think about when you think about cybersecurity. But the administrative is all of your policies and procedures, the stuff that's in your handbook. The reality of it is we all probably have handbooks, we all have policies and procedures, and nobody has any idea what's in them. Any of them. Right? And that's just honest, right? And so there's a concept called tabletop exercises, where what you do is you pull out one of these policies and you say, all right, guys, we're going to pretend that we just had X happen. what does our policy say about Susie, who answered the phone when this happened? And everybody goes, I don't know, right? And that starts to open the door for, well, let me tell you what our policy says, right? And you sort of gamify it and you walk through these scenarios, these tabletop exercises, and you do it in a fun way, a rinsable, repeatable way, so that people become more familiar with what are your administrative policies. Because I can tell you, it's the human component, it's the administrative policies that are going to fail, right? And so those are the things you probably want to focus on so that people at least know what is your policy when you find a USB drive in the parking lot, right? For example.
Don't put it in your computer. I promise you
Don't-
that.
The answer is, hey, put it in your computer and have fun. No, I'm kidding. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yes, going back to the USB, so the question would be, where do you draw the line, or when is it too much control over an employee's device? So I've heard a million people say, oh, my company doesn't allow me to install applications on my own phone, and I need to go and ask them for permission. I cannot email a friend a picture taken from my phone. Then, so where should you draw the line, or when does it come too much control versus where do you use all of those policies and training rather than restriction and controlling the actual devices?
I think that's more of an choosing how much risk you were willing to accept. Because I mean, in the perfect world, you could not have a remote device or a bring your own device, but the reality is you need employees working remotely, in 2022. You need to have access to email all the time. It's not necessarily, the most fun thing. My wife probably doesn't like it, but I'll be at home and I'm going to have emails. So yeah, am I connecting to, my own personal Wi-Fi? Or do I have a company-issued phone that allows me to have a hotspot? I think it all depends on, how much risk you're willing to accept, and then also what kind of sensitive information we're dealing with. If you have a phone that's only used for calls and can't access your network, can't access your email, you probably don't have a lot of sensitive information that's at risk. But if you have applications on there that maybe aren't protected by multi-factor authentication and they have sensitive information, payroll, customer information, bank accounts, you probably want to put more stricter requirements around those devices.
Yeah. So it's a two-part question really, right? It starts with, do you have a BYOD or bring your own device policy? Does the company set an expectation to the employee? What happens if you use your own phone? What data is ours and what data is yours, right? I think it starts there. The second layer to that is there's a technology called MDM, or mobile device management. And one of the things that mobile device management does, and it actually does a really good job, is when you install it on a device, the first question it asks is this a company-owned device or is this a personal device? And one of the reasons why it asks that is because if it's a personal device, it creates what's called a sandbox. It's a folder, right? Everything in the folder belongs to the company. Everything outside that folder belongs to you on your personal phone. So if I open up the folder, I see Outlook, and in there is all of my email for the company. I close the folder, I have Outlook outside the folder. That's my personal email, and the company has no access to that. The company will then apply all of their policies in that folder. What applications will we allow? What applications will we not allow? Do we want to track the location of the phone? Do we require that the phone is encrypted? These are all things that you can decide at the folder level or at the device level, but they need to be backed up by your BYOD policy so that if the employee complains that you are being too invasive or that you're doing things that you shouldn't do, that you can pull up your policy and say, here's our policy, here's what we did, here's where you signed off saying that you knew that this is what we did, right? I will say more generically, I'm not a huge fan of BYOD. It opens up a lot of risk, but I also recognize that, from a functional perspective, sometimes, that's what we need, particularly with contractors and part-time employees and these kinds of things, right? So, MDM is sort of that solution in terms of how do we balance that, backed up with a policy.
Yeah, I would say more so than the data. In many cases, I guess, and in many of our clients, more than the data that they might have control of or could be exposed. It's really the clients that you serve, the third party aspect. I'm responsible for what I might do or don't in terms of through my entity, through my devices, through my communications, the damage that I can cause. And in our case, in Fulcro's case, we serve clients that, potentially could suffer through us, could suffer a catastrophic damage. And we're not, it's not the same causing, an incident or being at fault or responsible to a target than, to a small business.
Yeah, that's that connected risk, right?
Yeah.
And you think about this, how many people's email password is the same password as it is to the network? And if I wasn't protecting the phone and this was somebody's personal phone, I now have that person's email address, their username and their password. I can now log into their VPN, I can log in, I can gain access to the corporate network. And I'll tell you, that happens. How many people, not through show of hands, but Outlook web access, where you can go on the internet to check your email? Most hacked application on the planet. Because if I can get your username and password out of that, I now have access to the network. Worse than that, if I saved my password in the browser cache because I didn't want to type it, I can get any password out of any browser tops. Give me 8 seconds. It's not
Good to know.
right?
Be on this guy's good side.
I don't want to do anything.
Yeah, so you want to
I
be
was
careful.
going to ask about that because Microsoft and Google save it, and you tell them every time I go in there and I
Yes.
put my user ID, go ahead and put my password.
And
So-
I really appreciate you doing that because it cuts out 90% of everything else I'd have to do to get your password.
So what you're saying is. go
That's a
in
good
there,
practice.
Eliminate them all.
Absolutely, 100%.
How do you do that?
Clear them out.
Clear your cache.
Go to Google browser, security, privacy, passwords.
And I know we're not looking at a PC, but just to give you a sense of how easy it is, you right-click on the password field, you click inspect, and you change the word password to text. You click back on where the ... was, and it changes it to text. It's as simple as that.
Scary.
Everybody
Everybody looks at each other like,
Let me ask you
what?
something else. We have QuickBooks. It's in the cloud. Are they protecting us? Or can somebody go into our system and get it out of our system?
Intuit does a reasonable job, comma, I would make sure you always had your own backups of your QuickBooks data. That's something that you need to always be responsible for.
I think the question would be, can you access all the data for your customers in QuickBooks? Because then if somebody can get your access, they can access all that
We don't
information.
do that.
Okay.
That's good. We can certainly.
If I can ask an opinion on password managers. And to give you some brief history on why I started using password managers, you get your employee, they give him a password, welcome 123, and he never changes it. So a lot of companies and third-party softwares require you to change it. So they start putting 123, 234, 456, and there's something they can remember. So you provide them tools so that they can generate this 24-character password randomly generated, really hard to crack. But then if you at least look at my profile, if they hack my password manager, they could have access to pretty much
That's right.
everything.
That's right.
So what's the best practice on that? And I don't know.
Or are those well protected? Those
Password managers?
Password managers.
It's probably highly advised that you protect that as much as possible.
So here's the real answer, right? Again, I'm going to repackage your question. If I wanted to attack anybody, who do I attack? The person who has the most valuable data. Who is that? Password managers, Amazon, Azure, Outlook Web Access. That's probably my top 4, right? And so when it comes to password managers, I can tell you LastPass is probably one of the most popular ones out there. They haven't been hacked in 60 days. Okay? But they get hacked fairly regularly, right? But if you look at what we recommend is there are actually applications that you can buy, like Password State's one of them, Secret Server's another one of them, that you host on your network that does not have a public-facing component that you secure and you store so that people don't see that as a large target, right? Because if I had LastPass and I get into one account, I get into all of their accounts. And this is where you start to see these crazy numbers like 100 million accounts were compromised. Well, how is that possible? I got into a honeypot. I got into the thing where there's lots of really good data, right? But if you have 50 employees and I have my own password manager and it's behind my firewall and it's on my network, number one, it's a whole lot less attractive because it's the same amount of effort to compromise 50 people as it is 100 million, right? And two, it allows me to retain control of that data.
Is Apple better?
No. The Apple, it's like anything, right? It's not a technology problem in many cases. Apple Keychain can also be compromised. So can Linux boxes, servers, desktops, workstations. It doesn't matter, right? Even Microsoft's, BitLocker, which is disk encryption, right? There's a very simple flaw. And a lot of times when we think about security, right, we have this concept that that companies are taken care of and they're not doing silly things. And so when somebody says to you, hey, did you know how this is how it works? You're like, wait a minute. My kindergarten knows better than that, right? So take disk encryption for Microsoft. Where do they keep the encryption key to unencrypt the hard drive for disk encryption that Microsoft uses? On the same hard drive that's being encrypted. How hard is it to attack? Not very difficult. You got to type in 128 numbers or whatever, but it's nothing crazy. Because the key, that's like putting the front door to the key under the mat, right? Like if I'm a criminal, I'm checking the flower pot, I'm checking under the mat, like I'm checking obvious places, right? Don't keep the key on the device that I'm trying to protect. That's bad news, right? You see a lot of that, and the Apple Keychain does that as well, right? They keep the encryption key paired with the device Because they're worried about people losing the key. Because it's true, if you lose the key, you lose access to the data. So from a perspective of how do we make sure that we don't get the angry phone calls to the guy that says, I lost my encryption key, but I really need access to my data. What service can I pay for to unencrypt my device? The answer should be none, but it isn't.
I was going to say that we can certainly keep the conversation going, but with a little bit of wine and some appetizers. We usually do this like wine and cheese, but via the Latin American Chamber of Commerce, they did an accelerator program for women entrepreneurs, and we decided to bring food from two of those. One is from one Comaos Food. Her name is Carla, and she does tequeños. And the last note I wanted to bring over to mention is that MIS prepared I'm going to share with you a QR code and a link. They are sharing. Good question. They are sharing with us valuable information. One is from a breach coach, and then the other one is an IT security roadmap. So we are going to send that via email to you. Check the name and the email address. Make sure it's ours. No, I'm kidding. But we're going to share that with you. And please, let's keep the conversation going. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining. And a special thanks to both Augie and Lliam for sharing all this knowledge with us. I hope it was valuable for all of you. We all learn things in these events. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.